slavery, and then race-based segregation and Jim Crow, the federal government had an vested interest in undoing some of the evils of racism that it had actually propped up. The question here is there anything remotely comparable to the situation of being African American in the South in the 60s to being gay or lesbian in Oregon or Washington State today? And that's where I think honest liberals are going to say exactly what the ladies in the front row just said. No. And so that's where I'm saying, like, you always want to think about, given the audience that I'm trying to reach, and if it's an audience that's not going to agree with everything I believe, what can I do to help them move closer to where I am? And I think it does help them see that, unlike the South in the 60s, Oregon and Washington State have plenty of gay-friendly bakeries and photography studios and florist shops, and there's no justification for the government to be coercing this baker and this florist and this baker. Yeah, right behind you.
If the Church Amendment protects doctors and nurses regarding abortion, why doesn't the same prevail concerning flowers, pictures, and cakes?
Because we don't have a law like that yet. So, I mean, let me, I'll mention it, because I was going to save it for the next session. I was trying to space out, but all these things bleeding together. At the federal level, there's a bill called the First Amendment Defense Act. It was introduced in the House by Raul Labrador and introduced in the Senate by Mike Lee. And what this does, and it's almost, it's in our conception for it, we modeled it very similarly on what the Church Amendment did on the abortion debate. The First Amendment Defense Act, it goes by the acronym FADA. So if you hear people talk about FADA, that's what they're talking about. It says that the federal government can never penalize any individual or institution because they believe marriage is the union of a man and a woman, and they act on that belief in their practices. It singles out several things in particular. Nonprofit tax status is one of the things that it singles out. The IRS can never revoke an entity's nonprofit tax status because they believe marriage is the union of a man and a woman. It singles out accreditation. Accrediting agency could never revoke the accreditation of a school because they believe marriage is the union of a man or woman. Government grants, government contracts, government loans, employment. It goes through a host of ways in which the federal government interacts with individuals and institutions, and it creates a bright line. So unlike RFRAs, which are our balancing test, it says on these issues, there is no countervailing force. There is no compelling state interest. In the same way that there's no justification ever to coerce the doctor or the nurse to perform an abortion, on these issues, there's never a justification for revoking the nonprofit tax status or taking away the accreditation. There are state and local versions of FADA. The First Amendment Defense Act, again, you can only tie the hands of the federal government by the federal government. The federal government can't tie the hands of the states. So one of the things that you can consider in your state is having a law that would say the Wyoming government and maybe all of its subdivisions, so the states can tie the hands of the cities, because cities are creations of states, that the Wyoming state government and all of its subdivisions would never penalize someone because they believe marriage is the union of a man and a woman. And you could specify that that applies to businesses, that applies to schools, that applies to adoption agencies. You can list off all the areas in which you want that to apply. You can then have exceptions. So like the First Amendment Defense Act has an explicit exception for health care that would say that this doesn't apply for visitations in a hospital. So they want same-sex married couples to be able to visit each other. So if a hospital was denying someone visitation rights, then the federal government could take action. So that's one. But they don't want, for example, a hospital to be coercing. So licensing is part of it if you're a marriage therapist. And you say, well, look, I provide marriage therapy, but I can't help a same-sex couple live out a healthy marriage because I don't believe in same-sex marriage, right? And so there's a difference here between not allowing a same-sex couple visitation rights when they're having surgery and then counseling them in their marriage where all I'm saying is legislators know how to draft this. You can get good language on these bills. The conceptual issue is, don't we want to be the type of society that can tolerate each other even when we disagree? So what you want to do is make an appeal to people who are in favor of gay marriage do you really want to drive that 71-year-old grandmother into bankruptcy? She's being sued in both her professional and her personal capacity. So both her business and her home are on the line. Or do you think a better way of handling this situation is to go with your suggestion of, if you're in favor of it, you can bake the cake. If you're not in favor of it, you don't have to bake the cake. From an education perspective, think about it this way. What makes America, higher education, unique and distinct and great is that BYU has the freedom to be authentically Mormon. Wheaton has the freedom to be authentically evangelical. Notre Dame has the freedom to be authentically Catholic. Harvard and Yale get to be authentically secular Ivy Leagueish, right? Or whatever their identities are. Rather than saying every school has to be the same, part of American diversity and pluralism is that we have the freedom to be different. And if all colleges were the same, it would greatly reduce our choice when deciding where do we want to study. And by letting BYU and Notre Dame and Wheaton be different than Harvard, Yale, and Princeton, it actually creates a better atmosphere for education. And so something like the First Amendment Defense Act would simply prevent the federal government from stopping that. We don't want the federal government saying that, no, the only way you get to be an accredited nonprofit college is if you accept the government's new ideology on marriage. I think that's a message that we can sell to the American people, that even if they disagree with us about same-sex marriage, they can still say BYU should be free to be Mormon, Wheaton should be free to be evangelical, Notre Dame can be free to be Catholic. There were questions over here. Yeah.
Just two. One about the Center for Medical Progress. Do you know anything about them and what they're having to deal with? And then also, do you have any bright spots, positive things? You know, like I've heard. I don't know if it's somebody that wrote with you about France, that there's protests about marriage. They're seeing some good in traditional marriage and so forth.
Yeah, a great question. So the Center for Medical Progress is the investigative journalists that have done the 12 videos on Planned Parenthood. I haven't followed their legal troubles particularly closely. My understanding is that it has something to do with California disclosure laws for hidden videos. And so there are 2 videos that a judge has said can't be released until they have the judicial process to determine how they were acquired and were they acquired under false pretenses. And the idea here is that you want to have laws that protect you from kind of being entrapped and from being secretly filmed when you think you're talking to someone who isn't you. And so you could imagine this, you probably wouldn't want someone going into the confessional and recording it under false pretenses. So you could see some situation in which you wouldn't want to have that sort of thing going on. I have no idea what the truth is in that, right? I mean, the complaint here is that when there was an environmentalist group that had some undercover videos about animal mistreatment, they all got front page news coverage and they were primetime ABC, CBS, and NBC. But when it happens on this issue, they not only are ignored by the media, but now they're being investigated by the courts. Which doesn't say, so I don't know what the legal merits are. I think for the videos that have been released, they are a game changer. For people who have actually seen these videos, there is no denying that what takes place in those Planned Parenthood clinics is that human beings are killed. Body parts are being harvested. And they're human body parts, right? At one point the technician says, oh, another boy. It's a human boy. And I think the people who have seen this have it's something that you can't unsee. And that's where I think, and I was going to mention this some more in the next session, but why not now? I think some of the people, for a while, the pro-life movement had a bunch of old, angry white men as its leading spokespeople. And that wasn't the most effective public relations strategy. Now you look at it, and it's a bunch of like young, articulate, attractive women who are some of its primary spokespeople. You know, people like Lila Rose, who was one of the first ones to do these undercover videos. The Center for Medical Progress, its founder was a friend of hers who kind of followed in her footsteps. When you see Lila on TV, it's very hard for someone to say, well, that's just because you hate women. Right? You can't say it with a straight face. Whereas they would attack you. If you went on wearing your clerical collar, right? Oh, you're just one of those big, mean Catholic priests and you hate women. Right? I mean, that would be the type of... They can pigeonhole you. It's much harder. And these videos, and ultrasound, it just speaks for itself. I think that people like Heather Barwick and Katie Faust and some of the children of same-sex couples have a capacity to just change the narrative. When they share their testimonies and say, we love our two mothers, but we wish we would have had both a mother and a father. We used to be in favor of gay marriage, and when we got married and saw our husband fathering our children, we realized that that was a bad idea. And now we're not in favor of gay marriage. I think they have a capacity that they can tell a story that is different than what I can do. I mean, philosophy only goes so far. I think it's, it's necessary, it's important for you guys to have it as background knowledge. But there's a reason why Jesus spoke in parables. Jesus was telling stories. And the biblical narrative as a whole is a narrative, right? We're a narrative storytelling species. And I think the ability of hearing some of these voices, it used to be that Barbara Boxer and Nancy Pelosi could claim to speak for all women on the abortion issue. And now we see that's not true. We have Feminists for Life, we have Silent No More, we have Women Speak for Themselves, we have people like Lila Rose, and they've blown up the media narrative that women speak with one voice on the abortion issue. I think in the same way, on the marriage issue, it would be very helpful if it wasn't assumed that Andrew Sullivan speaks for all gays and lesbians. So another thing, in addition to the children of gays and lesbians, I think people with same-sex attraction who choose to be chaste can be a very powerful counter-media narrative. The Apostolate Courage, it's a Catholic group that ministers to people with same-sex attractions. They made a documentary called The Desire of Everlasting Hills, and it simply tells the stories of 3 individuals with same-sex attractions who choose not to act on them, choose to be chaste, and how it opens up meaningful non-marital relationships in their lives. Part of our problem is that we think it's either marriage or it's loneliness. Anthony Kennedy explicitly says that in his opinion. He says we have to redefine marriage because otherwise gays and lesbians will call out and there'll be no one there to answer them. And it's this terrible, emaciated understanding of human sociality and of community. There are all sorts of non-marital communities that matter, that can be significant. And we need people like that telling their stories. Eve Tushnet has recently published a book. I haven't read it yet, but I'm going to recommend it anyway. It's called Gay and Catholic. Eve Tushnet is the daughter of Mark Tushnet, a professor of law at Harvard. She was raised secular Jew, educated at Yale University, where she becomes Catholic and comes out of the closet as a lesbian, but chooses to remain chaste. And she's written a book about it. Just imagine that narrative. That narrative defies every media expectation. Harvard professor father converts to Catholicism at Yale and chooses to be chaste, though she's only attracted to other women. Hearing from some of those voices is going to be a very powerful way of changing the framing that the media typically casts on these issues. Yeah.
I'm an ex-lesbian activist myself, and I've given my testimony at different places. But one of the lies that I am constantly confronted with is the born that way lie. And there is no scientific data to prove it, but the culture has absorbed that untruth for so many years that the media, Hollywood, and the academic, all schools treat that as though it's true. Yet here I am, a living ex-lesbian Christian, but free by the grace of God. Here I am. How do you dispute me?
Yep. So and that's why you've seen them try to marginalize. Was it Spitzer who was doing some of these studies? Got him to renounce one of his studies on this. What's interesting is that it's not just that there's no scientific evidence that shows people are born this way, is that there's mountains of scientific evidence to show that they're not. I mean, so all the scientific evidence that we have suggests that sexual orientation is similar to most other aspects of human personality, that it's part genetic, it's part environmental, and it's part of your childhood, your experience. Most of our traits of our personalities are going to be partly based on our biology, partly based on the environment, and then partly based on our upbringing. The actions, the choices that we make that go and shape our future choices, which is simply to say that this means culture matters. The type of environment, and the way that they did this was that they could look at twin studies who were raised in the same home, twins who were separated at birth, and look at what the outcomes were. And there was no higher incidence rate of same-sex attraction. And so they said, wait, let me get that right. I think there was a slightly higher, but not a very significantly higher. So that, it's partly genetic, but that there was a wide enough gap that it's also environmental and behavioral and upbringing and all sorts of the other things that normally go to make up a personality.
It was about 15%.
Was it 15%?
Yeah, 15%.
Perfect. Yeah.
85% other factors.
Yeah. And so, I mean, this is the type of thing where after the law explicitly says we're going to use the media to tell people that it's a born this way phenomenon, even though we know it's not true. I mean, so it's interesting that you don't want to be a conspiracy theorist, but sometimes there actually are propaganda campaigns, and I think that on that particular question, that was one of them. Yeah.
You may want to comment on this, but in your book, second book, you talk a fair amount about the studies with children. How much confidence in the University of Texas versus the other studies can we have in? My understanding is that even the University of Texas study was limited by database. But how much confidence can we have in stating these things?
Yes, so, I mean, we can have full confidence provided we state them accurately. I mean, I think that's a nice lawyerly answer. Here's the reality of the social science on same-sex parenting. There are only 8 studies in existence that use large, random, representative samples when investigating the outcomes for children raised by same-sex couples. And all 8 of those studies, when analyzed accurately, come to the conclusion that children do best when raised by a married mother and father. That said, there are only 8 of those studies. So this scientific inquiry is in its infancy. Other social science questions, we have hundreds and hundreds or thousands and thousands of studies that use large, random, representative samples. Here we only have 8. Now, the reason you probably haven't heard about these 8 is that we then have dozens and dozens of non-random, non-representative, non-large samples that said that lesbian mothers are actually the best mothers of all. So when you saw the studies that the media would frequently talk about, when you saw the studies that actually, I think to their discredit, the American Psychological Association cited in their amicus briefs with the court, not a single one used the gold standard methodology for social science. The average respondent, and it was these were mainly self-reported studies. So it was, tell us about how your children are doing. We're doing a study of same-sex parenting. And then can you recruit your friends to be in our study? It's a methodology called snowball sampling. Think about how a snowball rolls, and it compounds the biases. The average respondent in these studies was a double-income, double-college-educated lesbian couple living in San Francisco or Manhattan. And so from a non-representative sample, you can't draw representative conclusions. And those were the studies that the APA relied on. So we can with confidence say, those are helpful for us to know what is it like to be raised by a double-educated, upper middle-class, white lesbian couple living in Manhattan. Right? Those studies are good for answering that question. They're not good for us telling about the population as a whole. To draw a representative conclusion, we need a representative sample. And we only have 8. That said, those 8 studies are entirely consistent with thousands of studies that have been conducted over the past 40 years about family structure in general. So we have thousands of studies that compared married, intact mothers and fathers to 4 alternative family structures: single parenting, cohabitation, divorce, divorce and remarriage. We have thousands of studies using large random samples, and all of them came to a resounding consensus that the best place for children were married mothers and fathers. That's why President Obama could say, we know the statistics, that quote that I read you. Dan Quayle, when he criticized Murphy Brown, was ridiculed And then several months later, the Atlantic Monthly runs a cover story with the title, Dan Quayle Was Right. Because this is actually an issue in which social scientists themselves changed their opinion. They thought that single parenting and divorce would be good for children because it would keep women out of abusive relationships, it would free them from patriarchy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They looked at the data and they saw we were wrong. Normally academic change takes place because old scholars die and then new scholars enter the academies with different ideas. Here you actually get an example of scholars saying, we once thought this, we've now investigated the data, we saw we were wrong, and here's a true conclusion. The scientists point to three causal vectors for why it is that marriage matters. And I think this helps us see why those 8 studies, I think in the long run, will be vindicated. The 3 causal vectors are biology, gender, and stability. Why does marriage produce good outcomes for kids? One, because biology matters. Having a double biological connection with a child seems to produce better results. There's something about having biological ties that matter. The second is that gender matters, that men and women aren't interchangeable, that moms and dads are interacting with kids in different ways, and that produces better results. Yeah. And the third is that stability matters. The reason why cohabitation and divorce, and even divorce and remarriage, don't produce better outcomes is that all those transitions are rough for children. Now, what do we know about those 3 things when it comes to same-sex parenting? There won't be a double biological connection with same-sex couples. There won't be both gender forms of parenting. And preliminary evidence suggests that it won't be particularly stable. And to understand why, this is what preliminary social science is showing on same-sex relationships in general. And we don't know whether having the legal form of marriage will change this or not. So that's an open question. But in general, what we know is that same-sex male relationships tend to be more sexually fluid, sexually open than male-female or female-female relationships. And it's not because they're gay, it's not because they're homosexual, it's because they're men. Having a double male relationship tends to exacerbate the typical male tendency, which is to be slightly promiscuous. So if you have 2 men, you don't have the domesticating influence of a wife, right? Women civilize men. That makes sense. So on the other side, so if you have the male-male, the male-female, and then the female-female, it looks like the female-female relationship of those 3 types is the shortest lived relationship. And again, it's not because it's something about lesbians or homosexuals, it's because of women. Women tend to file for the vast majority of divorces in the United States. And so when you compound that with 2 women, there tends to be a higher threshold for emotional intimacy. You've probably never heard any of your sons break up with their girlfriend and say, oh, I broke up with her, my emotional needs weren't being met. That's not the typical reason why guys break up with girlfriends. That is a reason why girls break up with boyfriends, or girlfriend break up with girlfriend. So right now, the social science shows that the female relationship is the shortest, the male relationship is the most open, and the male-female can avoid both of those kind of extremes. So for stability, it seems like that's also, it's an open question, but preliminary evidence would suggest that it's not going to go well. So that would seem to be the 3 causal factors that make marriage matter, biology, gender, and stability, simply won't be present in the average same-sex parenting situation. So those 8 studies that we do have, if the social scientists are willing to do this science dispassionately, use large random representative samples and analyze the data without being biased, I think those studies would be vindicated in the long run. Other questions? Yes?
What I've noticed continually with ordinances or any legislation, there is a great deal of resentment behind the decisions that the city council or the state legislature would make. And because of that, it becomes very hard to speak to an issue. Specifically, I heard last night that Barack Obama passed a executive order saying that all schools would have transgender bathrooms or they would not receive
That's the Department of Education. So Obama's executive order was for federal contractors. So you're right in the big point, but just to clarify, Obama about a year ago issued an executive order that said all federal contractors had to have one of the sexual orientation and gender identity non-discrimination statutes. And then the Department of Education has reinterpreted Title IX. So Title IX is a 40-year-old law that was passed by Congress to combat sex discrimination. It was to ensure that women had equal opportunities in education. They're now interpreting the sex discrimination to include gender identity. And so there's a public school in Illinois who had a transgender student, a boy who identified as a girl. And they said, you can use the girls' restrooms because they're all single stalls, so we don't have to worry about privacy. Go in, shut the door. You can use the locker room provided that you change behind a curtain because you're still anatomically a boy. And we also have to balance the privacy concerns of the girls who are in the girls' locker room. And because of this, so here the principal is trying to find a compromise solution. Right? You can use the single stall restrooms of your choice. You can go to the girls' locker room, but you have to, go behind the privacy curtain. They were sent a letter from the Department of Education, the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Education, saying, we are now interpreting Title IX 40 years after the fact to mandate this transgender bathroom and locker room policy. And if you don't abide by it, you're going to lose all federal Department of Education funding. And not just for that particular school, for the entire school district. So frequently there's a financial component to this. You're exactly right. It's what we saw. Why did Indiana back away from their Religious Freedom Restoration Act? Because big business was opposing it. Right? So you had Apple, you had the NCAA, you had all sorts of big businesses saying, we don't want Indiana businesses to have the freedom to do what we're doing, running our businesses in accordance with our values. Right? So you had big business saying, we're going to boycott your state unless you deny small businesses the freedom that we are currently exercising as big businesses. So that, the double standard is just blatantly obvious. But that's how they're doing it on some of these government grant programs. They're attaching strings to it. And it makes it nearly impossible. For example, there are 3 universities in the United States that don't take federal funding. It's Hillsdale, it's Grove City, and it's Wyoming Catholic College. Those are the 3 who have, I guess the president is in the back.
Yes.
But here, so here's the thing. They're still at risk. Because even though they're free from the government funding hook, the government can go after their nonprofit tax status. And what happens if all of the alumni giving is now taxable income? So the college has to pay taxes on it, and the alumni who are giving the money don't get to deduct that from their tax burden. What happens if the accrediting agency says, we're not going to accredit you because you have a bigoted view of marriage? So the funding is part of it. I think that's an important part of it. That's how they're going after this public school in Illinois. But they're going to find other ways to go after you as well. And so it's just to be aware that the tax treatment, the accreditation, or just a straightforward mandate. I mean, what they're doing with the HHS mandate, that's not about government funding, that's not about your tax status, that's not about your accreditation. That's just a law that mandates every health insurance provider has to cover these drugs and devices. In a couple of weeks, I'll have a paper coming out for Heritage. There's now an HHS proposed mandate. It's in the review process that'll say every healthcare plan has to cover sex reassignment surgery. And they're doing this as an implementation of it's the sex non-discrimination clause, saying that sex non-discrimination just means gender identity non-discrimination. And so this mandate, if it becomes law, would mean that every healthcare plan would have to cover transgender hormones and transgender surgery, but also that physicians would have to perform it. That you would, so in its current iteration, it doesn't have a protection for the medical judgment, the conscience, or the religious beliefs of medical professionals. Because think about it this way, there are some medical professionals who aren't religious, but just think it's bad medicine to be doing these reassignment surgeries. Dr. Paul McHugh was the chief of psychiatry at Johns Hopkins. And after more than a decade of Johns Hopkins doing gender reassignment surgeries, he said, well, we should actually investigate whether or not we're helping these people. And we should see what's been the outcome. They did a study. They saw that they weren't making people's lives better by doing the surgeries. So he put a stop to it. And for the past 30 or 40 years, Johns Hopkins no longer does sex reassignment surgery. It seems that one of the implications of this new Obamacare HHS mandate, should it actually go into effect, would be that they would have to do so. And the physicians have to do so, even if it goes against their best medical judgment. So again, that has nothing to do with funding or tax status or accreditation. It's just a straightforward government regulation. And so there's a variety of ways in which they can go after you. Yeah?
Did they ever give a reason why those 7 drugs were to be covered by all insurance plans? I mean, why not insulin?
Right.
Why not something else?
So it's 20 drugs and devices that the FDA has approved as essential preventative services for reproductive health, 4 of which could cause abortion under FDA labeling. So the Green family from Hobby Lobby was objecting to those 4. Wheaton College and the Baptist universities are objecting to those 4. The Catholic institutions are objecting to all 20. And what happened was there was a closed door behind the scenes meeting of medical experts. And they said these 20 drugs and devices, contraceptives, are essential care for preventative health. It's not clear to me what they're preventing, what disease they're preventing. It seems that conception is actually a sign that your reproductive system is working. So I mean, like, regardless of your moral evaluation of contraception, it's just hard to see it as a preventative health care measure, because it's not actually preventing a disease. But yet it's mandated under the preventative care aspect of Obamacare. And the reason this took place is that when Congress passed Obamacare, it says essential services as defined by the Secretary of Health and Human Services shall be mandated. So then the agencies, all this legislation is outsourced to the agencies, and the agencies get to do this with almost no accountability. All they do is they will issue a proposed rulemaking. So that's what they've done now in the transgender piece. I think last Friday was the deadline for offering comments. And the USCCB, so United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, issued a wonderful comment on this. So if you do a Google search, you can find it. And it just goes through about 7 different reasons that this proposed mandate would be problematic, especially for Catholic hospitals and Catholic doctors and all the rest. But that's how much of this stuff gets done. And that's why I'm saying that, from a religious liberty perspective, the founders, before they got to the religious liberty concern, would have said, why are we delegating legislative authority to the Secretary of Health and Human Services in the first place? And what gives the federal government authority to mandate that people have to do sex reassignment surgeries in the first place? Right? When we were creating this more perfect union, that's not what we thought the federal government's role would be.
Wrong union.
Yeah.
What's that?
Wrong